Acorn Productions, this is Ray Blair. Mr. Blair, Civil War is here. So, I don't know, taking the drawings away. I might have a little bit of map work here for us, but taking the drawings away. So, coming into the election of 1860, the Democratic Party, the last national party, meaning party that could receive votes, electoral votes on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line between the North and the South, fell apart in its convention as a plank to adopt the institution of slavery as a positive good, or supporting the institution of slavery failed, and then the Southern Fire Eater Convention walked out. Ultimately, they nominated two separate candidates in the election of 1860, and this led to the guarantee that the Democratic Party wouldn't win the nomination. Still relatively obscure at the time, Abraham Lincoln emerged from a party of Republicans, from a slate of different Republican candidates at the convention as the Republican nominee. It was very possible he could win the election without even being on the ballot on several southern states, because there were enough electoral votes in the North to win a presidential election. And then the Constitutional Union Party was created in kind of a Daniel Webster type of motif or theme. This is John Bell of Tennessee. No coincidence that he's on a border state, but John Bell of Tennessee running for the Constitutional Union Party, saying, let's forget anything about slavery and let's just agree to vote for this and support the Union and holding it together. Ultimately, Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860, and almost immediately South Carolina seceded, followed by 6 other states in the coming months before Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president. After his inauguration, he stated his position that the southern states, the Confederate states, had not seceded because they didn't have the constitutional right to, and the Union was still preserved no matter what they said as they created the Confederate States of America. Ultimately, the issue over one of the last federal possessions in the South, the possession of Fort Sumter, triggered a skirmish between the United States and the Confederacy, and war was declared. And very short enlistments were created for soldiers to sign up and volunteer for the war, as 4 more states joined the Union. But due to the moderate position of Abraham Lincoln on the issue of slavery, which said this war wasn't about slavery but to preserve the Union, 4 slave states stayed within the Union, some partially with coercion, but this tilted the balance between the Confederacy and the Union even more than it would have been. With the short enlistments, the Union Army went down to Bull Run to defeat the Confederate Army and march to Richmond. And had that worked, this would have been a short war, and maybe the suffering of the South would have been shorter. But it did not work. Stonewall Grant earned his name. The Union embarrassed itself and ran back with picnickers to Washington, D.C. with a do-over. It would be a long war. It would be a long war that would use a strategy called the Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan, and this is not a very good map, but the Anaconda Plan would use a period of strangulation, blockading the South by ocean, cutting off the riverways, and breaking up its rail connections to make it very difficult for the 11 Confederate states to supply its capital at Richmond. The Anaconda it was actually a derisive term. It was like, basically, you're going to slowly crush it to death. That's going to take forever. Why don't we just go win the war? But this is the plan that ultimately is going to win. And there's 2 theaters of war. There's the fighting between the capitals, in which this would fail again and again for the Union Army. So they would continue to fire generals, like losing NFL football teams fire head coaches. And in the West, everywhere else, it's not a great name for theaters, but in the West, which is everywhere else, the Anaconda Plan was applied, as the Union, under the leadership of an unlikely successful general named Ulysses Grant, marched down, captured Tennessee, had a setback at the Battle of Shiloh, which was technically a Union victory, but still was such a bloodbath. It represented that the warfare at this point had progressed very close to what we'd see in World War I, and the level of losses in the individual battle were so large that it defied imagination, even as it happened. But he came back from that later to capture Vicksburg, which was the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, and then led troops to Chattanooga. So this is the Anaconda Plan, and I just jumped through like 2.5 years of warfare. and this is kind of slow going. He was promoted to the Eastern Theater, which hadn't been going well for the first 3 years of the war. And his subordinate, General Sherman, went into Georgia, slowly took Atlanta, and then almost unopposed began a vicious march to the sea in Savannah. I teach at a school called Battleground Academy. You guys all know this because anybody who's watching this is one of my students being shared this link. But our school was named when the Confederate General John Bell Hood went to Tennessee instead of chasing Sherman during his march to the sea, trying to capture the supply lines in the fort at Nashville to cut off Union supply lines and make Sherman come back. The major problem with his plan is even the supply lines of the Union were guarded by many more men than Hood had at his disposal, and ultimately he led a failed assault on a fort in Franklin, Tennessee, that led to the near destruction of his army, which was later captured when he kept chasing the Unions all the way to their base in Nashville, and then he was captured. Sherman's march to the sea helped inflict defeat upon the South that lasted for generations, and it is considered one of the things that made a second Confederacy less possible. When asked why he could justify doing such things, Sherman said, "War is hell." I'm sure he said it much more dramatically than I did, and he started marching northward to recapture South Carolina, which was the hotbed of rebellion. I think his history books pay more attention to the march to the sea because of the timing of the war, but he was more vicious in South Carolina as he marched through. So that's the context for the battle in the East. So the way the Anaconda Plan worked is first you cut off all supplies to your enemy by blockade. Then you break up its riverways and rail connections to the point where it just doesn't have enough supplies to fight. The Confederacy found very early in the war a very effective general named Robert E. Lee, and his war was nearly flawless until Gettysburg in 1863. But he was very difficult to defeat in battle, and he was very effective at staving off the relatively inept Union generals' attempt to capture Richmond. If you look on a map, it looks like, what's the problem here? It's right down the street from Washington, D.C. But militarily, to go directly from Washington, D.C. to Richmond, they had to cross so many rivers, and Lee was wonderful at exploiting this. So there was a series of battles and a series of generals. General George McClellan had what Abraham Lincoln and others dubbed a case of the slows. He prepared his army and he loved his soldiers, but he was so afraid to use them. And then there was a series of other generals, including Ambrose Burnside, whose main characteristic that got him the job was saying, "President Lincoln, I don't think I'm up for the task." And after the arrogant McClellan and a couple other generals that he found to be arrogant, Lincoln said, "I've found my guy." And Lincoln finally stumbled upon the most successful general in the Union, who was an interim general who would be removed of his post afterwards. When Lee, in 1863, marched northward for his final time into Pennsylvania and created the Battle of Gettysburg. This is a very abbreviated version, but in the Battle of Gettysburg, it was a 3-day battle. It was an optional battle, meaning Robert E. Lee wanted a big battle on northern soil so that he could convince an ally like Great Britain to join the war, and specifically Great Britain was the Confederates' target ally because cotton was king in the eyes of the South, and Great Britain not being able to import cotton would cripple their economy, and they would have to come to the aid of the Confederacy in this war. This never happened, and it was at Gettysburg that Lee tried to achieve a battle on northern soil to gain the attention of the British, similarly to how in the American Revolution the Continental Army captured General Burgoyne's army at the Battle of Saratoga and gained the alliance of France. Again, didn't happen. The Union was well dug in and still made some mistakes, and victory was possible. The recent loss of General Stonewall Jackson in the Battle of Chancellorsville maybe was one of the reasons that this opportunity by his successor was not realized. Ultimately, General Lee tried a valiant but misguided charge into the heart of Union lines on the third day because previous attacks had been kind of diversionary, and he was hoping the center of the lines weren't as defended as they might be. Called Pickett's Charge, and the outright failure of that charge led to Lee limping back to Virginia, and Lincoln wanted Lee captured before he made it back. So his interim, General George Meade, was replaced by Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant comes in 1864, and he's no more tactically successful than other Union generals at defeating Lee. But he has one thing that he has on his side, which makes it tough to be a soldier in his army. He knows that staying on the task of attacking the Confederacy was the way to win, no matter the cost. So he just pushed in the campaign of 1864 and 1865 at Lee's defenses. And he didn't overplay his hand, but he kept pushing at Lee's defenses and bloody battle after bloody battle until he was at the Petersburg kind of rail junction near Richmond, and he laid siege like he had earlier in the Battle of Vicksburg at that point. And this long siege made Lee's position in Richmond ultimately untenable, and Lee tried to make a run for it into the hills of the Appalachian Mountains, depending on how you like to pronounce them. And Grant was ready for that and chased after him and caught up to him in a town called Appomattox Courthouse. And at that town, Lee surrendered to Grant, effectively ending the Civil War. As the war was winding down and Abraham Lincoln was urging a lenient peace, a actor named John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln at a play in Washington, D.C., and this would be the last bitter taste on the tongues of many Northerners as they sat down and considered how to initiate the terms of peace for the Confederacy during Reconstruction. Again, a brief overview. There's a tremendous amount, and there's a lot of interesting things about the Civil War, and the context I'm going to explore in a subsequent video, and they're very important contexts. But that's the brief overview that helps you get through the general story, no pun intended, of the war. I will see you soon.